So thank you all so much for joining us. Best-selling author Marie Benedict will discuss her new historical fiction mystery, The Queens of Crime, in this installment of Author Hour in Massachusetts. So Marie, who needs no introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway, is the New York Times and USA Today best-selling author of The Queens of Crime, The Mitford Affair, Her Hidden Genius, The Mystery of Mrs. Christie, The Only Woman in the Room, Lady Clementine, Carnegie's Maid, The Other Einstein, and with Victoria Christopher Murray, the Good Morning America Book Club pick, The Personal Librarian, and the Target Book of the Year, The First Ladies. All have been translated into multiple languages, and many have been selected for the Barnes & Noble Book Club, the Target Book Club, the Costco Book Club, Indie Next List, and LibraryReads List. And Marie is joining us from Pittsburgh, where she lives with her family. So all nearly, we'll say 300 of us who are watching live and the many more that will watch the recording. Let's give a big virtual round of applause to Marie for joining us here tonight. Marie, thanks so much for being here with us. How are you?
I am so great. I mean, this welcome is unbelievable. I mean, the claps, the hearts. I feel so fortunate to be here. And as we talked about a little bit earlier, Robert, if you know me and you know my work, you know how much I love libraries. So to be able to talk to so many libraries in the Massachusetts region, and I'm looking at the chat and I can see there are people coming in from all over the country. I just feel so fortunate to be here with you all tonight. And I want to thank you all for taking time out of your schedules to chat with me and to chat with us.
And Marie, I mean, the pleasure is all ours. So thank you so much for being here with us. And tonight you're here to discuss your latest, The Queens of Crime. Wondering if you could give us a brief
Sure.
2 or 3 minute synopsis of what the book is all about.
Absolutely. So The Queens of Crime is about the five brightest and best mystery writers from the golden age of detective fiction, England, 1920s and 30s, all women. And the way in which these five women come together to solve a very real life murder and secure justice for themselves and others. So it's very much in keeping with my other books. We focus in on five women, but one in particular, and talk about how these women who've left behind this vast legacy, they really created this classic murder mystery genre. So we're exploring that, how they managed to do that in really almost inhospitable circumstances, but then the way in which these women are drawn into what is a very real murder and the way in which they actually did play a hand in investigating it. So that's sort of my elevator pitch about the book.
Well, I am hooked. And I finished the book yesterday. Definitely one of my favorite books of the year. Without,
Yeah.
I'm going to say number one, my favorite
Oh,
of the year.
thank you.
I've read a lot of books so far. I know we're just starting our fourth month of the year, but I have so many questions for you, Marie, and I'm not even sure where to begin. Let me ask you this: what inspired you to write The Queens of Crime and bring these legendary women to the forefront?
Such a good question. Oh my gosh. It's almost like, how long do you have? Because the story for how I came to write about these women, this time period, really starts a long time ago. It started when I was probably middle school, if I could really go back. And I had this incredible aunt who was an English professor. She was a poet and she was a rebellious nun. And when I say that, I usually get a bunch of reactions, but if you know, you know. And she was really the one who kept me in books. You know, I was a voracious reader. I was the oldest of six children. And to have somebody who was such a huge reader and writer themselves help select books for me was a gift that I really am still reaping the benefits of today. In the large stacks of books that she would always get for me, were always several classic murder mysteries. There was always an Agatha Christie. There was always, not always, occasionally some of the other women who are my big five in this book, a Dorothy Sayers and Nio Marsh. So I grew up really reading these books, which are, set in these witty dialogue time periods of the 1920s and 30s with these smart women with all this moxie. And there's these unsolvable puzzles at their core. And I just grew up steeped in that time period and in that sort of that genre that these women really helped create. And I've always, always loved it. When I finally, after a very long law career, turned my attention to writing these books, I became curious about so many women, including these women that I had really grown up with, right? Very often I knew the books, I knew the author's name, but I really didn't know anything about the women themselves. And I started, of course, with the most famous of the five women, and that was Agatha Christie. I had actually started out writing another book about Agatha. It's called The Mystery of Mrs. Christie. It explores the very real life disappearance. She disappeared for 11 days in circumstances that honestly seem torn from one of her own novels. It's just unbelievable. And as I was researching her life in this particular time period, I started to come across Dorothy Sayers a lot. Now, Dorothy Sayers, she was known for, she was nearly as popular as Agatha Christie during her time. And she was known for these books starring Lord Peter Wimsey, a gentleman detective, as so many of them are, except he had a little bit of a twist. He had a female, for lack of a better word, call her a sidekick here, but she was so much more than that. Her name was Harriet Vane. And the interplay between these two, I always loved, really, really since I was in my childhood. And I came across Dorothy again during this research of Agatha, and I learned that the police, when they went to go investigate Agatha's disappearance, they called in two writers. They called in Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, writer of the Sherlock Holmes mysteries, and they called in Dorothy Sayers, who was a famous mystery novelist. Like what this says about the police department who was investigating Agatha's disappearance, that they thought these two fiction writers could help. But because of that, I really became more and more curious about Dorothy. And I ended up going down the rabbit hole into her life, and she was an amazing woman, so far ahead of her time. She was one of the first women to get an Oxford degree. She was a successful advertising executive. I mean, she was just so many things before she even became a full-time mystery writer. And when I learned that she had actually been involved in a real-life murder mystery, that was kind of when all those pieces coalesced, and I was hooked on telling this story.
Marie, let me ask you this. Why do we all know Agatha Christie, but I would imagine very few of us know of the four other authors? Why is that the case?
And that is such a good question. I wish I knew the answer to it. Why Agatha's name is the one that not only has survived, but is actually synonymous with these classic murder mysteries, when really they all played a hand in fashioning them. They really did. I think in part it's the sheer volume of her work, right? Agatha wrote so many novels for so many years. I think, in fact, her disappearance, it was basically a worldwide media event in 1926. And I think that kind of put her name on everybody's lips, So people knew Agatha Christie from that. Whether she liked that or not, I don't know. But I do think that heightened her name recognition. It's funny because in some ways I feel like Dorothy is the one we should know, because Dorothy is, I would say, the most modern of those women. The issues that she tackles in her books have such modern day resonance. She threads through these like really funny and smart murder mysteries. She threads through questions of, can you have a work-life balance? Can you be a mother and a writer, or a mother and have a career? Is it possible to have an equitable marriage? All these questions that sadly have not yet been resolved today, but I would think modern readers would really, really relate to. So that's one of the things, because I went back and reread a lot of these books as I was writing this novel. And in every one of these books, there's things you're like, ooh, I wish she wouldn't have said that, or that just doesn't really hold up quite the way you'd like. But I felt like some of these core themes in Dorothy's books really, really resonate today. And so in some ways, I'm kind of surprised that her books don't live on quite the way that Agatha's do. That said, at a later point in her life, Dorothy stopped writing murder mysteries and she kind of turned to, she translated Dante's Inferno, she turned to some theological writing. So part of it might be just the sheer volume of her work and the fact that at a certain point she stopped writing the books.
So you mentioned that you read a lot of these authors' works, and that raises a question from Randy. I wish there was a bibliography of the best one or two books to read for each of the mystery authors who are members of the Queens of Crime. Of course, I've read Agatha Christie, but none of the other four, and I need a pointer with which books to start my plunge. So, for the four other authors, could you
Oh,
kind of a big tough question? Did
great
you have
question.
get a book recommendation for each of the other four authors besides Agatha?
Wow. I mean, I should do that. In fact, I'm going to do that. That's such a good question and a suggestion
Yeah,
from the chat.
yeah,
Um,
Randy.
Randy, sorry. Because I don't think I can see all of those.
Yeah.
I think, and I'm going to do that this week. If you follow me on Facebook or Instagram, I will post a list of some recommended titles by these women. Thank you for asking that. So I'll back up a second and tell you a little bit about each of the women and I'll give you kind of off the top of my head what I would recommend. I reserve the right to change my mind in the Instagram or Facebook if that's okay. Um, I'll start with Agatha. I mean, most people know Agatha. I will say, gosh, some of my favorite of hers are the classics. Death on the Nile, because I'm also obsessed with ancient Egypt, so that was always a favorite. And Murder on the Orient Express. I mean, she's so many other good ones, but I do believe that those two are some of the most famous for a reason. There's just something about the setting and the puzzles that is just really powerful and unique. Dorothy Sayers, I would say she wrote, maybe, I can't remember the exact number, but a dozen, 20 Lord Peter Wimsey books. There are four with Harriet Vane. Those are the ones I would recommend. I absolutely love them. The interplay between the two, the way those stories are structured. I think the first one might be Strong Poison, but don't quote me. I will post it on Facebook or Instagram. You guys will have to follow me. I would say for Nio Marsh and Marjorie Allingham. Okay, so Nio Marsh, you probably don't know her. She was this fabulous New Zealander, fabulous writer, but also a theater director. She was deeply steeped. She's really credited with, I would say, like almost creating the theater scene in New Zealand. She was really, really involved. She wrote a series about it's, oh my gosh, am I going to get them mixed up? Inspector Allen. And Marjorie Allingham, a quintessential young English woman, she wrote a series about Inspector Campion. Now, these two are both kind of like gentlemen detectives, different types of personalities. I would recommend those. They're not, you can read them as standalones, but kind of like with Dorothy's books, there is a character progression in all of these series. Agatha's books, I really feel like for the most part can be read by themselves. Even her recurring detectives, there's not a tremendous amount of personal growth happening in them. I would definitely say with these other three women, especially Nia Marsh and Marjorie Allingham, you see a lot of change in their main characters. And so I would recommend starting at the beginning with those. The fifth, and I'll post what those are. The fifth is Baroness Emma Orczy. Now she was probably the most dramatic, romantic character of the group. She was the oldest. She was in her 70s. These women range in age from their 20s to their 70s. She was a Hungarian aristocrat in exile. And she's actually much more famous for, even though she wrote mystery books, she's much more famous for her Scarlet Pimpernel books. People seem to know that character, even if they haven't read the book. It's been adapted in so many different ways. He's the Scarlet Pimpernel, for those people who don't know, is really the first dual identity action hero. He was a English aristocrat who by night wore a mask and a cape and saved French aristocrats from the guillotine. So any sort of like Marvel movie, DC comic, Superman type character, two personalities, it all started with the Scarlet Pimpernel. She wrote a quieter mystery series, and I will post that one on Facebook and Instagram. She actually wrote two. I'd want to think about which one I'd recommend first of the two. These women were so fabulous. I mean, you have this multi-generational friendship, different backgrounds, different continents, which was it's somewhat different socioeconomic circumstances, not wildly so. But I also think, you don't see a lot of that in real life at that time. People, especially in England, but certainly all over the world during that time period, people really tended to stay in their groups, in their social strata with people like them. And so these women were really creating an unusual friendship group at this time. And again, that was something I really wanted to explore. And one of the things that really attracted me to writing this story was the way in which their bond, their relationship, ups and downs, really helped further along not just their writing and their careers, but their development as people.
So just to reiterate and clarify, Marianne in the chat asks, were these five authors actually friends in real life? Did they know and associate with one another? Yes, Marianne, that's what makes this novel so amazing. Marie, I wanted to ask you, so you just gave the rundown of each of the five and a recommended book. Why did you tell the story from the perspective of Dorothy? So all five were protagonists, but the story was told through the point of view of Dorothy. Why did you choose her?
Well, can I back up 1 second to
Sure.
just add something to the question?
Yeah.
Yes, these women really knew each other and they really were friends. And I think they probably traveled in the same circles in England, but one of the ways that they really came together was through something called the Detection Club. And that's something that Dorothy was really instrumental in founding. Other authors were participated in it as well, including Agatha and a whole bunch of other men. But Dorothy was really one of the spearheading it. And the Detection Club is a very real life thing. It exists today. It was a gathering of about 28 to 30 of the best mystery writers in England at the time. You had to be invited to join. It was sort of a way for them to get together, support each other. They would read each other's works in progress. They would talk about ways to elevate their craft. That was really a bee in Dorothy's bonnet. This was really when this genre is being formed in the way we think of it today, the classic murder mystery. And as it's new, there's all sorts of variations in quality coming out from different authors, not necessarily the ones in the Detection Club, but kind of in the field at large. And the reputation among reviewers and in sort of the literary community wasn't what Dorothy had hoped it would be. And I think one of her main goals was really to elevate the craft, to create some guidelines so that it would be well received and well regarded as any type of literature. And so they had these rules that they had to follow. And this in part answers your question, why Dorothy was one of my characters, one of the ones I really wanted to focus on. In part, it's because of this. There's another part to it, which I can talk about, but in part, it's because of this. It's because she was the one driving this, and so much of these women's legacies. And when I say legacy, when we think of the classic murder mystery, we think about Agatha Christie, but these women were helping create that as well. Some of the men too, but these women were really instrumental. So it's a legacy that they all really, in some ways, are responsible for. So in any event, the Detection Club, in order to kind of hammer home the importance of these guidelines, Dorothy created this very fanciful ritual for the initiates into the Detection Club to participate in. They would come into the whatever hall that they had rented for the evening. The initiates would have to wear dark robes, very dramatic, and they would have to carry lit candelabra. And they would approach a stage. On the stage were the president, which was G.K. Chesterton, famous from the Father Brown mysteries, Dorothy, and I think one or two others. Dorothy would hold a theatrical skull that had the name of Erica. And the initiate would have to put their hand on the skull and recite this vow. And this is it's very long, but here's the long and the short of it. That the author would promise to solve their fictional mysteries with logic and without an act of God, feminine intuition, mumbo jumbo, jiggery pokery or coincidence. So often in these early murder mysteries, it was like a well put together plot, and then all of a sudden somebody at the end would solve the case who had never, or was the villain who had never even appeared before. So, this was all part and parcel of her effort to really elevate the craft. So that was one of the reasons I was really interested in having Dorothy as the main character. There's two other reasons. One is that Dorothy is actually the one who was involved in investigating a murder. Um, and that murder, which we can talk about, that murder actually kind of potentially brought to the surface and threatened this very deep, dark secret that Dorothy kept. And this is all real, the murder investigation, the secret, all of it. Um, she was hiding this secret that if it came out, it would have absolutely ruined her professionally and personally. And this murder investigation really brings that to the forefront. It makes her very sympathetic towards the victim of the crime. That becomes leverage for the murderer against her. It makes her really think about this dark secret and how she's going to manage it. So it's these two things really came together in such a very neat way that I really did want to put Dorothy at the forefront. That, and I was really fascinated by the way in which her fictional character of Harriet Vane, I actually think is an autobiographical stand-in for her. I really do. I think rereading those books, I'm like, this is Dorothy. So, that was also fun for me as well to kind of channel that part of it.
Great. One of my favorite scenes is towards the start of the book. Can you talk about? I guess I would almost call it like an icebreaker exercise that Dorothy creates for three of the I guess well three or four of the other authors.
Yeah. Yeah, she creates in this women's club. It was like a university type club, but you didn't have to go to college to join it. She sets up basically a parlor game that was pretty popular at the time, which is like a murder mystery. There is somebody, feigns being murdered, and the victim hides clues around the room to see if you can solve it. And these five women knew each other from the detection club, but at this point in the story, they're not as tight as they become. They really become this unassailable unit as the book kind of progresses. But at this point, they know each other. They're more like colleagues than friends. And Dorothy, who's sort of this big, boisterous personality, kind of launches herself into a room. She decides that this is the best icebreaker possible, and she is the victim. And so these women, it's really fun, the way in which they kind of are exploring this room and talking about how they solve mysteries and how, in this case, they would put all the clues together. It's really, it's only like a chapter or two, but it's what I hoped was a snapshot into the mind, the interior workings of these women, and the way in which they kind of approach their work, and they would approach a murder, which of course then comes in handy as they really do face a real murder.
And when they're trying to solve the real murder,
Mhm.
they ask themselves, what would the characters in my book do? How would they approach it? And that leads to a discussion as to how Agatha sort of writes her books a bit differently than the other
Yes.
authors. The other authors, I think, kind of start more so with their characters, where
Yes.
Agatha works backwards from the murder and
Right.
yeah. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. So I take that kind of seed that I plant in that parlor game that they're playing, their murder parlor game, and I kind of play it out as the book goes on. I don't talk about it overtly at first, but so these women kind of head out um, to back up into the murder, I guess, a second. Dorothy, she stumbles across this idea of getting involved in the investigation as a way for these five women to prove themselves. They're friends, but they really feel like they're not being celebrated, maybe let's put it that way, the way that they should be. And Dorothy's husband is a crime journalist, and he's asked to cover the murder of this Poor English nurse. It's a story. This is the springtime, and in the fall, the nurse had gone off on a day trip on a ferry with a fellow nursing friend. You could take a ferry back and forth in one day to the coast of France, and they went to Boulogne, which is a seaside town, and they had, a day exploring. And just as they were about to take the ferry back, May Daniels steps into the restroom at the dock. And her friend Celia McCarthy waits outside the restroom. It's a restroom with one entrance that also serves as the exit. There's no other way in or out. There are no windows inside. There are no vents. It's literally like a box with some stalls and a sink, right? Celia waits outside, and May never comes out. And it becomes her disappearance because it's so dramatic, right? And it seems impossible that she vanished in this way. It becomes a huge media sensation. Fast forward to the fall, no, and then she never shows up. No one knows what happens to her. Fast forward to the spring, and unfortunately, May's body is found. It's found in a wooded area not that far from the dock. And Dorothy's husband, Mac Fleming, is called upon to cover this murder, to get involved and do kind of his own investigative reporting into her murder. And Dorothy has the idea that maybe she'll come along. Maybe they should write. They pitched to his editor to a companion piece. He'll do the crime journalism. She'll do the investigation and the coverage from the perspective of a crime writer, a fiction writer. The editor loves the idea, and the two of them set off to try and solve the murder of May Daniels. Now, in my fictional world, all the women come along. I do believe that they most likely talked about it. One of the things that the women used to love to do when they would get together was basically take like the biggest crime of the day and try and solve it themselves. So they were always kind of dissecting, putting together, taking apart real life crimes and murders. And I can't imagine given Dorothy's proximity to these events that that wouldn't have happened in this case. So I just make it all happen real time. And so as these women, back to your original question with my long-winded answer there, back to your original question about how they write and the way their characters work plays into this investigation. I kind of see throughout their time in Boulogne investigating, and then back in England when the five women come back and try to understand not just what happened to Maid Daniels in France, but what happened to her beforehand, what her life was like, who she knew, what could have been going on that would have led to this terrible event. And you start to see bit by bit the women's personalities, their approach, the way they would utilize their different talents to try and glean information, piece things together. And then as the book progresses, they have an actual conversation about how that works. And like you said, one of the most illuminating things is how different Agatha is from everybody else. Everybody else has a slightly different approach, but all of them are somewhat character driven. Agatha is all about the puzzle. That's it. I mean, the characters kind of, I'll fit them in as this where it works with the puzzle. And that is distinct. That is really different. And I feel like in some ways you can kind of see that in Agatha's books. It is kind of all about the puzzle. Definitely there's characters that you love, Poirot, Marple, the sidekicks, there's a lot of recurring characters, but in some ways it's so puzzle driven. And you can see that with the way she actually constructs the story.
Marie, I appreciate your answers. They're so thorough, and you fill in the blanks, and you answer questions I should have asked, like about the detection club and about the actual murder. So no, I think it's good that you're giving us what you're giving us. So I did want to ask you sort of a general question about your research process. How did you approach the research for this novel? And what were the most surprising or unexpected discoveries you made during your research into the lives of these amazing, amazing women?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, my approach is the same no matter what book I'm writing, right? I'm looking for original source material. I'm looking for things that will really bring me into the women's interior life and really show me who they are. not somebody else's interpretation of what that is. But so what that looks like is letters. It looks like journals. In some cases, these women have autobiographies, some more reliable than others. That's another story. But there's some of these women were well known during their day. They have interviews, so all of that type of stuff is really what I originally go for. And then I kind of will cast my net wider and kind of look at, I mean, a broader picture of what their world was like, macro things like what's going on politically, culturally in their world, what's affecting them, micro things like what kind of wallpaper would they have, or how would they dress, or what kind of shoes would they be wearing. Shoes are a big problem in this book because a lot of the women choose very uncomfortable footwear and they're doing a lot of walking. So things like that which don't seem like they're super important are actually super important. So the women love their food. I love to research food and see what they would be eating, and they do love their desserts. And so, all of that is really fun. I think but it also brings the character, the story, the setting to life. The way I look at the research is it's the architecture of the story. It's the pillar, the foundations, the roof upon which the story hangs. The fiction kind of comes in those grayer areas where we don't know the answers, where it's shadowy. And there, I try and utilize my many years as a lawyer to kind of logically extrapolate from the research, from the things we do know, and the character that has evolved. These women they're based on real women, but I write fictional characters that are inspired by the women. So, that's kind of the way the story works and the research works. In this particular case, the original source material that I had there were a lot of letters. So for some of the women more than others. Dorothy, there's some wonderful letters. And there's some published ones that people can check out if they're interested. As I mentioned, I absolutely loved using Dorothy's character, Harriet Vane, as a source of her personality. I mean, writers do leave behind little bits and pieces of themselves in their books, whether they intended or not. What I've come to know of Dorothy, and again, I don't know her and she's my fictional character, but boy, there's a lot of parallels between her and Harriet Vane. And so rereading those wonderful Harriet Vane books was research. Boy, that's like a terrible task, right? To have to read novels as detective novels as my research. And two other things here. I mean, that's really how I got into the heads of the women and their part of the story. There's also another part of the story, and that's May Daniels. That's the murder. That's who she was, what happened to her, and also what the investigation looked like. And to do that research was different. That research, I really relied on the literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of newspaper articles about the case. The case was hugely covered, both in the fall during her disappearance, during the spring when her body was found. The articles, range from tiny reports to huge profiles. And those not only provided me with information about what happened to her, how the investigation went, the fits and starts, the theories about what happened to her, but they also shed, and this was probably to answer your question, what was most surprising. This was not something I anticipated finding, and it was new for me. They also shed a lot of light on the attitudes about women like May during this time period. Not all these articles, but several of them would talk about, would describe her, right? And it's sometimes when I'm doing speeches, I have a lot of the articles, and you can see there's a lot of pictures of her. And she has short, cute, bobbed hair. We think 1920s and 30s, that bobbed haircut. And she's often referred to as having a bob in the articles. And I thought it wasn't that cute. They're just describing her, sympathetic, whatever. That's actually code, depending on the newspaper. A young woman who had a bobbed haircut was a modern woman. She was somebody who rejected traditional values, and she's somebody who might not have traditional morals either. And that type of girl might not be deserving of the fullest police investigation possible. Those girls were also young, single working girls, were called surplus women. Surplus women were women in this interwar period, World War I to World War II, who instead of following on the traditional path of marrying and staying at home and taking care of your husband and children, were working and unmarried. Now, it didn't seem to matter that most of these girls didn't have anyone to marry. I mean, after so many young men were killed during World War I and the population decrease meant that there weren't a lot of eligible partners for these young women. It didn't seem to matter that often working and supporting yourself and remaining single wasn't a choice for these women. The women were kind of looked down upon for their non-traditional paths, right? And so threaded into these articles were these attitudes. And that is something that surprised me.
Yeah.
Wasn't something I'd ever heard of before. And it was, upsetting to see the way in which it impacted the investigation into May's murder. There definitely came points when I would say that the authorities didn't dedicate enough resources to her investigation without revealing what happened.
Mhm.
Just, that was a surprising piece of information that wasn't like really available on the surface. It's something you really had to hunt for.
Yeah, the way that the police treated the investigation, the way the journalists covered it, very frustrating. Very frustrating.
Very frustrating. And again, like, it's those are attitudes that aren't totally gone, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, yes, I do know. Marie, I will say that one thing that the five authors were able to do, however, is to sort of use their middle agedness, okay, and unassuming, unassumingness. I'm not sure if that's a
Good
word,
word. I like
but
it. Let's go with
but basically, that they were able to sort of hunt down some leads and crack the case, because they were not. I got to speak. I got to be careful what I say here, but basically they were looked down upon, and they were. I think taken for granted and
underestimated.
underestimated. That's the word, Marie.
Yes,
So in a
absolutely.
strange way,
I mean,
they used all of that again, in their favor when they were trying to solve the case. But it was frustrating nevertheless.
exactly. I mean, what they did is basically take those attitudes and turn them on their heads,
Right.
right? They knew that women were being underestimated and marginalized, right? It's what was happening to May Daniels, and so they conducted when they were doing their murder investigation, they used that, right? They took an approach that was different from everybody else. The male reporters and the male authorities, they were they had a very different investigation than these five women. These five women basically recreated May's life. They started with her day in Boulogne, right? They retraced her footsteps. They went around and talked to all the women that May and Celia McCarthy would have talked to during that day, women that had been ignored by the investigators. They pieced together the puzzle, and in so doing, that's where they started to find the clues about what was happening. And then they did the same thing once they went back to England to try and figure out really who this woman was and what could have happened to her. In taking that and turning on its head, they started to use what was by some perceived a negative and use it as a positive. Interestingly, too, and this is something you won't read in the book or in the author's note or anything, but I just do love this. Dorothy Sayers was so upset by this whole surplus woman thing and what happened to May and the attitudes that she encountered that she wove like almost like a social commentary about it into her books. So she has a gentleman detective, Lord Peter Wimsey, and the sidekick, Harriet Vane. But it's just Harriet Vane is much more than a sidekick, but I don't want to tell you because it'll ruin it if you actually read the books yourselves.
Right.
But Dorothy creates this employment bureau that is run by a single working woman, and that only employs, or puts out for jobs single working women. And what Lord Peter Wimsey does is he has this bureau and utilizes the women at this bureau to collect evidence. He sends them out, they send them out to these different crime investigations as governesses and secretaries and nurses. And they eavesdrop and they gather information because nobody thinks anything of them. These women are woefully underestimated. And so in these books, these are the women who help gather evidence and help solve the crime. And I love the way that Dorothy does that. She takes, what she's learned in this situation, this investigation, and she wants people to think twice about that attitude. And she does it in a way that people may not even realize at first, but is so compelling in the stories.
So, Marie, I have like 10 more questions of my own, but we're going to get to
Oh,
audience
geez.
questions. But what I
Sorry,
did,
I've been
no,
going on and on.
no, Marie, I didn't mean that in any way, in any such way. You're wonderful. I can listen to you all night. Okay.
Oh, please
Um,
don't. Be
but
careful what you offer.
what I did want to ask, my final question, you had mentioned that some of Dorothy's detective
Mhm,
maybe has some of her traits. I'm
mhm.
wondering, are there any? This actually comes from your book club kit, so I can't take credit for this question. But which of the queens do you most identify with, Marie?
Now, really, it's like asking me which of my sons I prefer. I love them all. Now, I say that, but I do have to say that, the book is more focused on Dorothy than the other women. And, this secret that she has, which is very real, um, and which I can't tell you because it's a big spoiler. It would be a big spoiler for the book. Um, this secret, is really at her core. It makes her so vulnerable. She carries a lot of guilt and shame around it. And it's something that just makes me feel very tenderhearted towards her. She's this woman who's really putting herself out there in the world, and yet she's carrying this enormous burden. And that's something that in some way that I think we can all relate to. Um, and I do, and of course, all these women have that. I mean, they all have their own, as we all do in life, right? Shame, guilt, you name it, secrets. But there's something very moving about hers. And also just the way in which she's processing these issues, which are so very modern. She's just someone I feel like you can really relate to, and I certainly do. So I would say maybe Dorothy, but don't tell the other women, okay? That's our secret.
All right. Your secret's safe with us. Folks,
Good.
if when you read the book, after you read the book, check
Yeah.
out Marie's website. The book club discussion kit's really fun. There's cocktail recipes. There's like a personality test. You can figure out which queen you're most affiliated with. It's a lot of fun. All right, so we're going to get to the audience questions. We got about 15 minutes here. I'm going to try to do this justice. So an anonymous attendee asks, are you friendly with any other female historical fiction writers? Do you ever work together? Are there a queens of historical fiction, Marie? And are you a part of it?
What a great question. I mean, obviously, I collaborate on a book, so I do on books with Victoria Christopher Murray. I will say when she started out, she had never written a historical fiction novel before, so she wasn't it wasn't like I was coming together with other historical fiction writers, but certainly a wonderful writer, and we've become very close through that process. I am very fortunate that I do have a regular Zoom with several other wonderful, wonderful historical fiction authors. We try to make it once a month, kind of depends on if people are on tour or have a deadline. But and it's so helpful just to see what other people are experiencing, how they're tackling issues, what's working for them. I mean, we're not solving murders. And I think maybe we actually were trying to do a retreat together this summer, and I was going to do a murder mystery game for us. So we'll see how that goes. But yes, I'm very fortunate in that respect.
All right. So many questions, so little time. Well, let me ask you this one. This is not related to the book, but it's a question that comes up quite a bit when we have authors who use pseudonyms. Why do you use a pen name?
Well, my real name is a combination of my everyday name and my pen name. Heather Marie Benedict Terrell is my real name. And the reason that I that I have that is because I wrote 7 novels under my everyday name, Heather Terrell, they're all different genres exploring a similar theme, the theme of the untold pieces of history and the different voices in history. And they were 3 books of historical suspense and 4 books for younger audiences, young adult audiences. And I almost look at those 7 books as like writing exercises. I learned so much about myself and about what I want to dedicate my time and my energy and my mission to. And I learned that I really mostly like the past. I really like to write the historical pieces. And writing for young adults is writing in the first person, a very intimate story. And I learned that I liked that. And it was those things coming together really formed the perfect kind of set of tools to explore these women, these untold histories of women. And so when I really turned my attention fully to that, my publisher asked if I would consider using a pen name, which is pretty common in writing if you switch genres. And I didn't want to, I could have just come up with something fanciful, I suppose, but I knew I was going to have to introduce myself as that. And so I chose a name that I felt comfortable with.
Excellent. So Mary Jo asks, how long does it typically take you to research and write a book?
Good question. Hard question to answer. So I keep a list of historic women that I'm interested in. The list is very long, and I come across these women all the time. There's so many women whose stories deserve to be told. And as once these women kind of pass my rubric and make their way onto my list, I'm kind of dipping into research about them on and off for a really, really long time. I mean, take Belle DeCosta Green, who is the star of my book with Victoria Christopher Murray called The Personal Librarian. I came across her for the first time in the 90s in the Morgan Library when I was a lawyer, when I was a young litigator who was disgruntled with being a lawyer. It took, nearly 2 decades to write that book. She was kind of standing in the corner about the whole time, kind of tapping her foot, waiting for me. But I was researching about her on and off that whole time. Other people I discover, and that's it. I want to write about them immediately. So, it's hard to put a fixed sort of timeline on how long I'm researching, considering, thinking about, mapping out stories for these women, because sometimes it's happening over a really long period of time and it's in fits and starts. I will say this, once I've kind of decided that this is the person I'm going to write about and start the deep research and the deep outlining and the deep writing till like when the editing is largely finished, it's about 1.5 years.
Anonymous attendee. So we just touched on this a little bit, but maybe we can get a little information about your next book. Not sure if you're able to divulge anything or not, but an anonymous attendee asks, I enjoy your novels tremendously. Thanks so much. How do you choose the next woman you're going to write about? And can you tell us who is the next person you will or maybe have written about?
Absolutely. So, how they kind of I told you about my list, right?
Yeah.
So how they rise to the top of that list, it's hard to say. Sometimes there's something going on in our world that I really feel like is very tied to that woman's story. It's very topical and timely. And so she'll kind of rise to the top. Sometimes the woman is dealing with something, an issue or a problem that speaks to me personally, something that I'm working through, something that I'm working on. And so she'll speak to me. It could be a number of different things, but almost always they're already on the list. And there's something about the woman, their story, their struggles, their legacy, which really feels timely to me. And that's kind of how they rise up. Who's next? My book that comes out in about a year, a little bit less, is called The Daughter of Egypt, Daughter of Egypt. And it's the story of Lady Evelyn Herbert. She is the daughter of Lord Carnarvon, owner of Highclere Castle, which is the estate upon which Downton Abbey is based. This is a real family. Lord Carnarvon, this 19-teens, 1920s, Lord Carnarvon was many things in addition to a lord. He was a car racer. He had a huge horse farm, and he was an Egyptian archaeologist. Every winter, he would, alongside a well-known archaeologist, Howard Carter, he would excavate. His daughter, Lady Evelyn, was brought up in a house where Howard Carter spent the summers there, and she became um, a home-trained archaeologist who loved ancient Egypt. When the Great War finally came to an end and they were able to re-enter Egypt and excavate again, Lady Evelyn was going with her father for the first time, and she wanted to find the tomb of Hatshepsut. If you're not familiar with her, she was the only female pharaoh. She had one of the most successful reigns in all of ancient Egypt. And upon her death, her name, her cartouche, was literally chiseled out of every monument, every statue, every stela throughout ancient Egypt. And so her identity was not known about for millennia. I can't even talk, millennia.
You sound like me, Marie. You can't talk.
Here we are. Lady Evelyn wanted to find the mystery of her tomb and where and what happened, why she was erased from history. And they set out to find it. And instead, they don't find Hatshepsut at first. They find the largest archaeological discovery of all time, and that is the tomb of Tutankhamun. Lady Evelyn Herbert is the first one in. So it's the story of this unbelievable excavation, which this young woman was hugely a part of, but it's also the quest for Hatshepsut. And woven into that story is the story of Hatshepsut, how she rose up to become a pharaoh when there were no female pharaohs, and what happened during her reign, why she was erased literally physically from history, and where I think her tomb is.
Marie, sign me up. When's the publication date on this? When's the release date?
I will let you know for sure. I will.
All right.
I'll be back.
Follow Marie on Instagram.
You'll have
folks.
me.
Yeah, absolutely. Linda, jumping back to Queens of Crime, we have time for a few more questions. Linda asks, how much traveling did you do for your research for the Queens of Crime? Did you use this as an excuse, Marie, to go to Paris, to go to London?
Yes, of course. I mean, part of my job requires that, right? There's rarely a destination that I have not or will not go to for my books. I will say sometimes it can be tricky. Yeah, I do love to go to seaside France, and I love to go to London and Highclere Castle. Highclere Castle is one of the few places that remains the way it was now as it was then. Most places that I write about are no longer look like that. Especially, take for example a book like The Only Woman in the Room, which is right there, which is set in 1930s Vienna. My character Hedy Lamarr lives in a very affluent Jewish enclave in Vienna that has been leveled. That was leveled during World War II. So, very often you can go to the place to get the look and the feel, and I do, but you're still really reliant on old maps, pictures, to really letters, descriptions, to really conjure up a place that really is no longer. So that is the one trick. If I could come up with a time portal, however, I would be very happy because I could just pop myself back there into the ancient past if I could.
Final question is going to go to Anne. Anne writes, as the mother of two disgruntled female lawyers, how did you transition from the law into writing? So Marie, what give us the Marie Benedict origin story in 4 minutes.
Please. I wish I had an easy answer for you. I think I started out not wanting to be a writer. A lot of writers do start out that way. I started out wanting to be a historian. It started in middle school. I was a history major in college, and I kind of got derailed into law school because it was the first time that women were really being encouraged to go to law school in very large numbers. And I felt fortunate to have that experience. I knew as soon as I started practicing, I liked the study of law. I didn't love the practice of law. I knew that wasn't what I was supposed to be doing. And for the next few years, I was trying to work my way back to where I started. And I thought maybe I'd go back and get my PhD. Then one day, out of the clear blue, I had an idea for a story that was tied to history. And I had never really thought about exploring that before. I had never written anything before, no fiction. And so for 8 years, I practiced law for 11 years. I was a commercial litigator in New York City. For 8 of those years, I chipped away at a book. I had no idea what I was doing. I just kept at it. I wanted to finish it. I didn't want to be somebody who talked about my book, but never finished my book. And by the time it was done, I knew that this was something I wanted to try. And I was fortunate that I was able to get that very first book published. And I've been publishing a book or two books a year ever since. That is not, I would say, a normal path. But what I do like to say to people who are disgruntled in their current careers, and I don't know from your question whether your daughters know what they want to do or if they just know they don't like what they are doing. The one thing I usually tell people is this, or I ask people is this, what did you love before the world got hold of you? And that usually is what did you love in middle school, early middle school, usually. And if you ask yourself what you loved at that time, whether it's a subject, whether it was a skill, whether it was a hobby, there's usually something in there that is very much who you are, that is your core self, your true self, not who you've become. And that can be someplace to start.
So, Marie, I'm usually the behind the scenes tech guy. Was there anything I should have asked that I didn't ask? Was there a topic we didn't cover that you want to very briefly mention? Any last words for us before we wrap things up?
No, I wouldn't say, I would say thank you. Thank you for reading. Thank you for being here with me today. Thank you for joining me on this journey to find these women. I mean, these women, I feel honor bound to tell their stories, and these are women who deserve to have a second chance to have their lives and legacy celebrated, much like all of us do. And so I just want to say thank you for joining me on that journey because I am a mission-driven lawyer. Don't say that, mission-driven writer. And I feel very lucky to have you all along with me for this ride.
Well, Marie, the pleasure was all ours. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Folks, please go out and buy a copy of The Queens of Crime, or at the very least, borrow it from your local library. But in the follow-up email and in the chat was a link to Wellesley Books to purchase an autographed copy that they'll ship to you at your convenience. And for those watching live, please take 60 seconds and fill out the feedback survey when you exit and look for the follow-up email with the recording in the next 60 minutes. So thank you all so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their night. Thanks again, Marie.
Thank you so much. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.